Then, of course, there's the dead bodies of hostages that need to be returned. And just yesterday, the IDF released the drone footage today. I don't know if anyone's seen it. Yeah, where you see Hamas digging a hole. They drag out parts of the hostage's body that they'd already returned the other half of this poor chap's body. They cover it with sand. And then as the Red Cross come around the corner, they dig it up again and present it as if they were trying to, adhere to the terms of the ceasefire deal. This is the kind of depravity that we're dealing with. And why are they doing that? Why are they playing this game? What I'm going to talk about is the various papers that I've written that will give you some insights into what's actually been going on for the last 2 years. We can then talk about the ceasefire and some of the breaches that have happened and where I think it will go next. And then we can talk about the challenges of phase 2 of Mr. Trump's ceasefire deal and some of the more difficult things that will come over the next weeks and months. Because even as I'm speaking now, there are IDF jets in the air over Gaza after Hamas has broken the ceasefire by attacking the IDF today. And this just shows you how challenging and complicated this is. I was very skeptical when Mr. Trump announced peace in the Middle East, because anyone who's studied the Middle East for a long time knows that there are no easy solutions in the Middle East. So during the war, I've been to Gaza 3 times, twice with the IDF, once with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. I've also been into tunnels in Lebanon with the IDF, the Yahalom Commandos, which is their underground warfighting specialists. And as it happens, I've also been to the front lines in Ukraine, but we're not going to talk about that today. So I'm going to talk for maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, and then I would really like it if you asked me questions, because I always think it's better for you to tell me what you want to know rather than me to tell you what I think you should know. So if there's any question that's been burning for the last 2 years, please think of what it might be. And when we come to the questions, hopefully we can have some back and forth, and I can fill in those gaps that might be in your knowledge. So my day job is I'm a researcher for the Henry Jackson Society in London. It's a think tank, and my specialist area is defense and the Middle East. You can check out the website, it's henryjacksonsociety.org, and you can search for all the papers I'm going to talk about. And the reason I'm asking you to look at them is not because I want you to read my stuff for me or to make my boss happy, but actually I wrote those papers for people like you. I tried to make them readable and accessible, full of facts, and it's stuff hopefully that you can take forward and use when you're having conversations about Israel and the war. Okay, I've written them deliberately to give ammunition to people like you, so you've got some facts to fight the sea of lies that surrounds this conflict. The first paper is called Questionable Counting, and it was the first proper analysis anyone had done of the casualty figures coming out of the Ministry of Health in Gaza. I think it's worth saying that the Ministry of Health is a very, very misleading name. Many people will try and tell you that these are simply innocent civil servants who are politically neutral. And even if a brand new government came in tomorrow, they would happily work for them. That shows a complete misunderstanding of how Hamas operates in Gaza. Okay, since 2005, when they took over, Hamas ruthlessly purged any political opposition within the Gaza Strip. Not only did they build up their fighting units, which was the Al-Qassam Brigade, they were, to all intents and purposes, a conventional army. They didn't have tanks, they didn't have planes, but they certainly had brigades, battalions, companies, a very high level of weaponry and sophistication in how they operate. But they also created their own government. All of the judges, all of the ministers, all of the administrators are all Hamas loyalists. And they still are to this day. So it's incredibly disingenuous. It's a lie that the world's media presents them as somehow a neutral and fair organization that's simply doing their best. They are absolutely doing the will of Hamas, and you cannot separate Hamas's fighting brigades from Hamas's civil administrators. They're one and the same. So what I tried to do with this paper is do the job that the world's media didn't do. Basic basic scrutiny and checks. We only used open source intelligence. We didn't have any sources on the ground in Gaza doing extra checks for us. We just checked what we could with what we had. And we found many mistakes. We found men listed as women. We found duplicate entries. We found adults listed as children. We found someone on there who died in 2014. Okay, and actually, it doesn't matter if this was deliberate or not. I'm not suggesting that they were deliberately trying to do stuff. They may well have been deliberately trying to do stuff, and in fact, it's likely they did, but I can't prove it. But what I can prove is that those lists weren't reliable, and it was wrong of the world's media to rely on them for nearly 18 months until my paper came out. And when you do an academic paper, it's always open to other academics arguing with you, and of course that happened. But I had the best possible verification of my paper from a very unlikely source. It came from Hamas. Because 3 months after my paper came out, they announced to the world that they agreed with me and properly deleted 3,000 names from the list completely. Okay, so this was just basic stuff that the world's media should have done but didn't. We found some other really interesting stuff in that paper as well. The first thing we did was look at past conflicts to see how reliable Hamas had been. And actually, in terms of the overall number, actually quite reliable. That's the number that history has gone with. And there's nothing to gainsay that. There's nothing to go against it. But what we did find was one thing they have done consistently in every single conflict is conceal combatant deaths, conceal the deaths of their own fighters. Now, this is clearly important because the figure in Gaza stands currently at just over 68,000 killed. Now, it's worth pointing out that is probably the least casualty-intensive war of the 21st century. Ukraine is higher, Syria was higher, the fight against ISIS was higher, ongoing wars in Nigeria and Sudan are all higher. Just today, you may have seen the videos that came out of Sudan. Absolutely horrifying that the bloodstains can be seen on satellite, such as the scale of the massacres that's happening in Sudan right now. That could easily reach 1 million killed in the very near future, and yet the world's media doesn't discuss this at all. But we have this number of 68,000, and that's been used to beat the Israelis with, because to believe the world's media, you'd think they were all civilians. You'd think that every single person in Gaza was innocent, and the Israelis had just been throwing missiles into Gaza for fun. In previous conflicts, Hamas have hidden those fighter numbers, and the IDF claim 25,000 roughly dead. Now, you might ask, why can't the IDF give us an accurate figure? Now, let me give you a soldier's perspective on this. War is an incredibly chaotic thing to be part of. If you look at Hollywood films, they very rarely give a fair and true representation of just how intense that experience is. And the closest I've seen on film is actually the opening 15 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, where you have that complete chaos and it's noisy and your adrenaline is flowing and it's scary. It's absolutely terrifying. Now, imagine you've just done that, and then you go back to your base or whatever it is, and they ask you, how many people did you kill them? How many people were shot? No, it's just not possible to give a really accurate total. But what they can do is they can do exactly what the United States Army or the British Army, or I'm sure the Norwegian Army do, which is you have an after-action debrief with your troops. You kind of get a sense for what happened and how many people were killed, and if you get enough agreement, then you've got a figure to go with. And the IDF do that with every contact. They then pass that up the chain and it gets added to the total. So they can give you a rough number, but that's why they can't give you that perfectly to the number accurate estimate of how many Hamas and the allied fighters have been killed. So what we also did was look at IDF estimates in previous conflicts to see how accurate they were. We know Hamas's overall numbers were roughly good. We know 6 months, a year, 5 years down the line, they announce how many combatants had died once the media fraud has died down. And actually in previous conflicts, the IDF were about accurate as well. So when we say 68,000 dead and 25,000 of them Hamas, that's probably about right, I would suggest. But again, that is an incredibly low number of civilians killed for the amount of munitions dropped. And you see this online all the time, where people say they dropped more TNT than the explosive power of Hiroshima and Nagasaki together. Okay, the fact that only 68,000 people are dead after more than 100,000 tons of munitions have dropped is remarkable. That shows the IDF is taking incredible care with civilians. They've killed less than one civilian for every ton of explosive dropped. Okay, that doesn't happen if you're not looking after civilian lives. Now, of course, civilians will die in war, and please don't think for 1 second I'm not incredibly sympathetic to anyone who's innocent in Gaza that's lost their lives. That is the tragedy of war. But it's not a war Israel started, and it's not a war that Israel wants. We also looked at media coverage during the campaign, and this is the sort of set of figures that I think will be very surprising. Or maybe not. But we looked around the world at who was using these figures and in what context they were using them. And we found out that of the 5 major outlets that we looked at, it was NBC in America, BBC, and a few others, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, 98% of them were using Hamas's figures. 3% of them were using the IDF's. So they would use the 68,000 figure or whatever it was at the time, and only 3% of articles would include that it mentioned that it included 25,000 Hamas and allied fighters going. One other thing that gets thrown around that might be useful to you to take away is they say, well, Hamas only had 30,000 to 40,000 fighters at the start of the war. Therefore, it's unrealistic to expect that 25,000 of them had been killed. Okay, this completely fails to understand the situation in Gaza. Hamas is not the only militant group. The next largest group is the Al-Quds Brigade, which is Palestinian Islamic Jihad's fighting forces. They are the main Iranian proxy in Gaza. Hamas are often called an Iranian proxy. They're not. They're kind of allied with Iran, but they don't have the same funding and arming as, say, Hezbollah do in Lebanon. But Palestinian Islamic Jihad absolutely do. They're the second biggest group, Al-Quds. And then you have a whole raft of small militias. There's maybe 7 or 8 different militias in Gaza, so the number of militants was way above the number of 30,000. And on top of that, Hamas, of course, have been recruiting throughout the war. So they've been replacing the experienced, trained fighters with quite often with children as young as 14 years old. Because all they really need to do is maintain control, have someone that could perhaps drop a bomb next to an IDF tank, have someone who could shoot at long range at the IDF soldiers. And they are absolutely on record as having used child soldiers. And even very left-wing NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have flagged this up in the past. So when we talk about the number of children that's died in Gaza, that's everyone that's under 18. Bearing in mind, of course, that Gaza's population was 50% under 18 before the war started. We can guess that a number of those under 18 on those lists are tragically child fighters as well. So all in all, this creates a picture of a war that is very, very different to the one that's portrayed in the media. And the media was the subject of my next paper, which is called Information Maneuver. And really, it talks through Hamas's tactics. So if we go back to 7th of October, Hamas had one aim, and that was to kill as many Israelis as possible, and then hopefully spark off a kind of regional war against Israel. We've seen papers have been captured in Gaza by the IDF that show that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, was hoping that Hezbollah in Lebanon would suddenly come over the border, that the West Bank would rise up against Israel, that maybe even the Syrian militia, where they had Hezbollah as well, would join in. And then, of course, we have the Houthis down in Yemen firing rounds at Israel. That was his original plan, that everyone would rise up at once and Israel would be wiped off the map. Now, clearly that failed. So what they did was pivot. They had a secondary plan where they tried to use international pressure to get Israel to stop. They also, of course, tried to use hostage diplomacy, which is where you take hostages to try and achieve diplomatic aims. They were hoping to trade hostages for a ceasefire, as they eventually did just a couple of weeks ago. But their secondary plan was A, to get Israel to stop fighting, and B, to degrade Israel on the world stage. And I think we can make a very strong case that that has been a really effective plan that worked really well. Now, let me talk you through Hamas's information capabilities on the ground in Gaza, because it's quite remarkable. Prior to 7th of October, the IDF had 750 troops in their information department. Hamas, much smaller, had 1,500 out of their 30,000 dedicated to information warfare. And the way it would operate is like this. If a troop of Hamas went out to go and attack the IDF, they would take a member of their information team with them with a camera. And it's designed to film what's happening. And this is then live streamed back to their headquarters, where they have very highly skilled and sophisticated video editors. And that's where you may have seen those red triangle videos with the red triangle floating above the IDF soldier's head as they fire the round. Okay, so that's where those videos come from. It's because they have dedicated camera teams that go out. However, there's a kicker here, because if everything goes well, then Hamas gets great video footage that they can edit to make it seem as if the IDF is getting beaten. Of course they're not. And the video is always cut off without showing the aftermath of these attacks, because as of July 24, when I was visiting 401 Brigade, their entire division had only lost 4 armoured vehicles in the entire war. Okay, Hamas have not been very effective at stopping the Israeli tanks and armoured personnel carriers, the Merkaba and the Nameh. But they get footage. So that's the win if that goes that way. If it goes the other way and the IDF kill all their troops, then guess what? The video footage still goes back, and then they've got someone in a press vest who is now dead. Okay? So we hear this figure all the time about 200 journalists. Absolute nonsense. Every single one of them, I would suggest, is Hamas. There are almost no independent journalists in Gaza. Because think back to what I said at the start. Hamas has a vice, a grip over the entirety of Gaza. Nothing happens there without their say-so. Okay, so all these people in press vests are Hamas media crews. So that's how they've operated. It's been incredibly clever, and it's worked incredibly effectively. So my second paper, Information Maneuver, talked about that. I also wrote a piece on the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So I was the first international observer invited in to film footage, and actually the footage I took went around the world. We got a light show as well. This is great. No budget spared by MIF. I love it. Yeah, so I went to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and to be fair to them, they let me film absolutely everything I wanted. There was nothing I couldn't film, nothing they didn't even ask that I didn't write about certain things. I had a complete freedom. And the footage I took did go around the world. You may have seen it. It was a sea of Gazans coming downhill towards the aid boxes. Quite a remarkable thing to see in film. Honestly, Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, some good, some bad. I don't think the IDF come out of it particularly well in that instance. Now, of course, the 1,200 people killed waiting for aid, that figure is not true. It's maybe a tenth of that. But look, they were using live fire to control the crowds, because to get to the GHS sites, they had to pass through the Israeli front line and then cross maybe 7 or 8 kilometers of area where there were dotted outposts of IDF troops. Hamas were trying to drive people off the pathway over towards the IDF. And they were using live fire to stop the crowds. As a soldier, I'm not comfortable with that. It's not a good way of doing it, not a great plan. So, we can be critical fairly of the IDF, and I don't think we should shy away from doing that. When they do stuff wrong, it's only fair that you say so. That's what makes you a balanced analyst and a balanced advocate, frankly. Because we don't want cheerleaders. We want people who can come at this and show that they have critical thinking. But look, the GHF guys were doing a really good job on the ground. I saw GHF, the American contractors, I saw them bandaging children's feet, taking a pregnant woman in so she could sit down. They showed real care and concern for the Gazans, actually far more than I realized they would, quite honestly. There was a real desire to help these people. But when it comes to starvation, there was nothing that I saw that comes close to what we imagine a famine looks like. And I can see from the crowd, you're certainly old enough to remember those famine pictures from the 80s of children with ribs that look like xylophones, The hollowed out cheeks, the sunken eyes, none of that at all. People were clearly in need. People absolutely needed aid. But the idea there was a famine is ridiculous. Since they declared famine in Gaza, there should be, by the IPC, by their own metrics, there should be 10,000 people dead of hunger in Gaza if there was a famine. As it happens, there's about 149 since the start of the war. Okay, so 400 since the start of the war, 149 since they declared famine. So there was a thousandth of what there should be. Okay, so this is absolutely not a famine by any metric at all. Now, what we do have is a situation where there is a war going on, and in some certain areas, there will be pockets of hunger. And again, we shouldn't deny that. That's just what happens in war zone. If people weren't hungry in certain parts of Gaza, that would be a miracle, quite frankly. Well, what we do know for a fact, or the UN's own figures, is that 3,000 calories per day, on average, have gone into Gaza per person since the start of the war. Well, I'm a big guy. I don't need 3,000 calories a day to keep going. The recommended is 2,000 for an adult human. There is enough food in Gaza for everyone, and that always has been. So the big question is, why isn't it reaching some people? And the reason is Hamas and other militants seizing the aid. 95% of UN convoys, 95% were getting intercepted by militants. On top of that, the GHF, 0% interceptions because they armed their convoys. Now, you can call this militarizing aid if you want to. You can call it politicizing aid if you want to. Frankly, I don't care. As long as the aid is reaching the people that need to eat it, I don't care if it's politicized or militarized. I just want people to be fed and not go hungry. And again, that shows there's something, a slightly skewed perspective some people have on this conflict, is they would rather Gazans go hungry than they would get them fed if it means a win for Israel. Absolutely twisted way of looking at the world. So that's the starvation piece I think dealt with. And then my next paper is coming out 4th of November, and this is the lessons that we can learn as Western militaries from the IDF. Now, it's not a bedtime read, it's 20,000 words of fairly complicated military stuff. But there is a huge amount of things the IDF have done very well in Gaza that our armies can learn from, because we know we have a threat over on the Ukrainian side of Europe. We know that our armies might well be, thank you, mate, back in the room. We know that our armies might have to go to war in cities, and who's just spent 2 years fighting in probably the most complex city any army can fight it. That's clearly the IDF. I think it does bear repeating that the tactical situation in Gaza is one of the most complicated scenarios any army ever has fought in. So you have a place of 2 million people where the civilians are prevented from fleeing by Egypt. Their reaction on 7th of October was to lock down their border with Gaza. So 2 million people, civilians can't flee. You have what they call the city of jihad underneath the ground, 500, maybe 1,000 kilometers of tunnels, far longer than the London Underground or the Paris Metro or the New York subway. You had the entirety of civic life dominated by Hamas. You had a battlefield that was above ground, at the tops of skyscrapers, underground in the tunnels, and then 360 degrees around you on the streets. And you had an enemy that was actively trying to get their own people killed. Okay, so my paper, Hamas's Human Shield Strategy, gives you 268 different examples of Hamas and how they have deliberately tried to force their civilians into harm's way. And remember, that's because they want to have headlines. These are monsters. That's a really important thing to remember. Now, I've seen more footage of 7th of October than even most Israelis have. I've seen the 47-minute video. I've seen various other stuff regarding the sexual assault and the rapes that happened that day. That's stuff they very rarely put anywhere near public for very obvious reasons, because it's protecting the victims. You know, the last thing the families of these poor people want is the suffering and misery of their loved ones to be broadcast to the world, to be denied by the people who support the other side. were backing Hamas. So I can understand why they haven't shown it, but I've seen it, and it is far and away the most horrific thing I've ever seen in my life. And I include 3 tours of Afghanistan in that. And it's so awful, I won't even describe it to you. Some of the things Hamas did on that day are truly into the realms of the demonic and the monstrous. The way they treated the various people they tortured and killed. Okay, so we are dealing with truly the worst of humanity when we talk about Hamas. Which probably leads me to the events of today. I think it's worth looking over the last 48 hours to see how this is going. Now, we talk about the hostage returns, and credit to President Trump for achieving that ceasefire deal in phase 1 that saw all the live hostages come home, which was a truly miraculous day. I'll be honest, I never thought it would happen. So to get that over the line, very impressive. Then, of course, there's the dead bodies of hostages that need to be returned. And just yesterday, the IDF released the drone footage today. I don't know if anyone's seen it. Yeah, where you see Hamas digging a hole. They drag out parts of a hostage's body that they'd already returned the other half of this poor chap's body. They cover it with sand, and then as the Red Cross come around the corner, they dig it up again and present it as if they were trying to, adhere to the terms of the ceasefire deal. This is the kind of depravity that we're dealing with. Why are they doing that? Why are they playing this game? Well, it's about control in Gaza. So Gaza is currently split in half, with the yellow line down the middle. IDF hold one side, Hamas hold the other. Everything Hamas has done since the ceasefire has been to try and regain control in those areas that they leave. There's a number of militias within Gaza from the clans that the IDF empowered to try and take on Hamas. Unfortunately, they don't have the manpower to fight Hamas. Okay, it's been a relatively easy job for Hamas to take control of those areas. Which makes it very difficult for kind of anyone to get an idea of what's really going on in Gaza, because Hamas have now 2 units. They've got the Arrow unit and the Rada units. It's got that horrible in Arabic at the end of the name. So for the rest of this, I will call it Rada, because that frankly sounds a little bit better. But Rada means deterrence in Arabic. Okay, so essentially you've got the Arrow, which is a kind of clandestine police force built from the Palestinian police, who are, of course, Hamas. They were originally designed to stop what they called looting, but what they effectively meant was anyone other than them doing the looting. Okay, so to stop anyone else from looting. And then you have the deterrence force that was set up using loyalist soldiers to attack the clans who have been empowered and were taking control of some areas of Gaza. So you've got Arrow, which is police, and then Rada, deterrence force, which is a paramilitary organization, and they work very closely together. But you'll have seen those videos, I'm sure, of the various people being executed on the street. The six people lined up and shot. I don't know if you saw that one. Yeah, that was Rada, I believe, was the ones responsible for that. So that's the sort of thing they do. And, as I said, very difficult to know what's going on in Gaza, but about 3/4 of the people they have so far executed are civilians. Okay, not from these clans. So 3/4 of all the deaths are just innocent civilians who've been caught up in trying to get aid or accused of being informants to the IDF. Again, that doesn't get reported. The challenge with phase 2 then is going to be that complete Hamas ownership of that area of Gaza. How on earth do you replace them? Because the second you say, right, if you're Hamas, you can't be in government anymore, then you lose the judiciary, you lose the police, you lose the guys who take the bins out. You lose every function of civil life. And we did that in Iraq back in 2003-4. Anyone who had been part of Saddam Hussein's regime was banned from holding any kind of position, which meant that you had nobody filling them. And you had a vortex, and then bad actors filled the vortex. And that's the danger in Gaza. But that means you'd have to try and come to some sort of accommodation with Hamas, which is clearly not acceptable to Israel. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is that we're working through this transitional authority, eventually getting to an elected government once again that the people of Gaza can vote for. And of course, if you don't get to that point, then you basically got people who are run by a dictatorship, so they're not going to accept that. But at the moment, Hamas is polling 70 to 80% across the West Bank and across Gaza. So if there were an election tomorrow, Hamas would win at a landslide. Because how do you get past that? So there's some really tricky challenges that need to be confronted when it comes to Gaza going forward. And as we speak, because of their ceasefire breaches, they attacked the IDF just today. The IDF have announced that they're going to bite off chunks of the area beyond the yellow line. Of course, the challenge there is that Hamas have now had time to put IEDs in the grounds, they've had time to set up ambushes, or they can just do what they did in Gaza City, where they drop their weapons and just melt away. And they become incredibly difficult to target. So my hopes for phase 2 are low. I think what we're probably looking at as a most likely scenario is that we'll see a repeat of what's happening in Lebanon, where the IDF just lets them get on with it, but retains the ability to strike back in as and when needed. It's not a permanent solution. It's certainly not peace in the Middle East, but it's also better than full sterile. How the reconstruction goes forward is another big question. We know we're talking about an international security force going in. Who's going to make that force up? There's talk of Indonesians, there's talk of Turkish, which the Israelis have said no to. There's all kinds of suggestions going around. We know there are 196 American staff officers trying to plan this right now. 4 bricks, that's right. Right, and four officers are in there doing the PowerPoint slides. But yeah, that's almost impossible mission, because the second you put them in there, I give it weeks until one of them goes bang, because Hamas are targeting them in some way or another. Or they just wait 3 years until Trump's gone, and then they pick up again. One of the 2 options I'd imagine is likely. How do you sell that to whichever country they're from? You're in Gaza, your troops are dying at the hands of Hamas. You know, I can see that turning into a sort of Vietnam situation very, very quickly. And of course, they won't be anywhere near as capable as the IDF. They won't take anywhere near the care that the IDF takes for civilian lives. And so we can potentially see even more Gazans dying as a result of this security force on the ground. And that's before you get to all the other problems I've just mentioned. So very, very tricky situation. There are no easy answers in the Middle East. And if you ask me what the answer is, I don't know, quite frankly. Okay, it's a matter of managing all of these different factors and just try to get to a place where it's less violent than it is now. But the bottom line, I think, for Israel is that their borders are once again safe. There's a buffer zone. Hamas's capability to fire rockets is completely destroyed. Hamas's capability to repeat 7th of October is hugely diminished. Okay, so bottom line is Israel safe, and then what happens in Gaza, frankly, is the Gazans' problem. And that's whose problem it should be. Because I think if we're going to get to a solution, one of the things we need to do is have accountability for the Palestinians in Gaza. Stop treating them like children. Stop saying that, they need people to come in and help them and they need aid. Okay, they need to stand on their own 2 feet if they're ever going to be a proper country of their own. If that's what they want, they need to take ownership of it. But that needs to come from inside. And that's a long way off. Okay, I'll hold it there, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Is that what you...
Eric Mandeville, I have a question about what's happening outside of the conflict. We look at the Geneva Convention. And you're not supposed to use women and children to hide. You're not supposed to use schools and hospitals to hide behind. And yet Hamas has done so very successfully over decades. Will this bleed over to other parts of the world where people are saying, well, it really doesn't matter, and we achieve our goals by hiding behind women and children and schools and hospitals?
Yeah, I know, to your point completely, and that is the danger of letting Hamas have anything that looks like a win, is that it encourages these tactics. Now, the difference, I think, with Gaza is that it's almost unique. It's almost unique in the scale of the depravity of Hamas. But to talk about hospitals, I'll segue slightly from your question, if you don't mind, because I think it's an important point. We know from the ceasefire that Hamas has been setting up interrogation centres across Gaza, where they've been dragging civilians and dragging people accused of working with Israel to torture and murder. Those centres are in hospitals. Al-Shifa, Al-Ahli, all of these places are being used once again by Hamas. Ask yourself, why on earth does Gaza, a place of 2 million people, have more hospitals than Paris? Yeah, ask yourself that question. There's two reasons. First of all, they are used by Hamas, and we've got plenty of testimony from before this war that people now try and deny that Hamas uses hospitals as command centres. There's also evidence from IDF soldiers I've spoke to that a lot of the power supply for the tunnels came directly from hospitals. They would have the cables sort of veer off down into the tunnel and they would power their underground network using hospital power. So hospitals, of course, have been heavily used by Hamas, but in a way that I think isn't really replicated elsewhere in the world for now. But the really important thing, as you say, is that we don't allow them to have a win from this, so that it encourages other malign actors around the globe to look at their tactics and think, that's how you defeat a modern army, is you completely weaponize the Geneva Convention. Next question. I guess, man, and then over to you, Sarah and John.
My name is Pia. I have a question. Why do you think the media on purpose deliberately are reporting wrong in this case?
I think more often than not it's laziness. It's a sort of a combination of laziness, of narrative capture. So there's this, I call it the halo effect when it comes to certain organisations, and the UN is the one I'm mainly thinking of. And the pattern we've seen time and time again is this. Hamas will say something. Some footage will come out of Gaza, they'll be filming stuff. And then Al Jazeera will repeat it. Because Al Jazeera and Hamas are completely in alignment. And a lot of the Hamas journalists in Gaza are working directly for Al Jazeera. And there was a report just last week that showed how closely those two have been working during the war. But unfortunately, Al Jazeera has spent many, many years building up this reputation in the West. It's seen as a highly credible news source. And they'll run the story, and then other news channels just pick it up and run with it. You've also got Hamas's friendly NGOs. So things like UNRWA. I mean, the idea that UNRWA and Hamas aren't hand in hand is just ridiculous. There's no way UNRWA could have operated in Gaza without Hamas's approval. But when UNRWA says something, and it gets repeated by NGOs, and it gets repeated by the UN at the top level, it comes with this halo effect, where because it's the UN that said it, then it must be true, because the UN's good, right? Unfortunately, what you're getting is something we call circular reporting, where people are citing each other and quoting each other and paraphrasing each other, but they're all coming from the same single point of information. When we're doing intelligence courses in the army, that's one of the things they teach us to look for, is to make sure you're not accidentally. So if you get source A comes in and says, this just happened, and source B comes in and says, this just happened, and you go, well, hey, these two are telling me the same thing, that must be correct. I've now confirmed this piece of information, but actually both these people have got it from the same original point. So you've got that circular reporting, and that's quite often what's happening here. And of course, we can't discount the power of various media outlets in the Arab world who are just nakedly spreading propaganda because they hate Israel. And there's that as well. So, Western news outlets can look at, say, Egyptian television or Iraqi television and say, hey, this story we're reporting, it's being reported by them too. They're journalists, they must have done their checks, therefore it's credible. And so you have this, and then once the narrative is set, it's incredibly difficult to change it, because once I put my casualty papers up, saying, by the way, you've been reporting on this wrong for nearly 18 months, actually, how many news agencies in the world are going to go, hey, sorry, we've been misleading for 18 months, sorry about that. It's not going to happen, is it? So once the narrative is set, it's very difficult to kind of change direction. And the final point I made is that we have, how best to phrase it, we have a situation where the world, certainly in the West, is framed as oppressor versus oppressed. And in that framework, there's almost nothing that, if you are categorized as oppressed, there's almost nothing that you can do wrong. You're blameless. You've lost your power because you're oppressed, so it doesn't matter if you commit a massacre of 1,200 Israelis. It's because you're oppressed. There's your get out of jail free card. Okay, and that sort of paradigm, that way of thinking about the world is also very powerful in the West, certainly. And I think a lot of people's positions on this conflict actually comes down to David and Goliath, and who you think is David and who you think is Goliath. I think that's quite a powerful kind of Christian heritage that we've got in the West, and then very often people split along those lines. Yes, just that.
My name is Dimitri. Speaking of Christian, I'm a Christian Lebanese, so I know a lot about what Palestinians do in the area, because we took a lot of Palestinians into Lebanon and they started a civil war. So the whole labeling of which organization it is, I think that's irrelevant, because they could rebrand. PLO just became something else, that became something else, that became Hamas. That's irrelevant. It's a religious fight. The only two countries in the whole area that have problems are Lebanon, because it was given as a Christian country by the French, and Israel, which was given as a Jewish country in the surrounding of Islamic surround. That's not racist, because I'm from there, so in case. Another thing is, let's say things as they are. I'm trying to say. Another thing is the infiltration of the West pre-October 7, that when October 7 happened, you were even scared to change your profile picture to an Israeli flag, because the infiltration happened before that. And everyone says that, yes, it started on October 7, but I think the invasion of the West and the mentality of the West started a long time ago. I'm witness to that. I moved to Switzerland in 1999. I moved to Norway in 2003. And I was talking about that for so much, and no one was listening. And now people still don't listen, and the consequences are going to be very deep. My question that's affecting me mostly, it's the relation to Norway, for example, or the West, what's happening here, and to my home country, my origin country, which is Lebanon, and why did Israel stop their attacks on Hezbollah, which is a terrorist organization? Why did they stop their attacks? And how was your visit to Lebanon, by the way?
So I went to a town called Maroun Al Ras in the south of Lebanon, which is just over the border from an Israeli town called Avivim. And we drove at night time. It's like two attacks whilst we were there, so we were in and out of the shelter. And then we got in the vehicles, drove there, and the entrance to the tunnel was through a cemetery. So the gravestones were just there, and the tunnel entrance was right next to you. The tunnel itself was remarkable. It was 2 kilometers of underground tunnel, drilled into solid chalk, far more sophisticated than the sandy Hamas tunnels in Gaza. It had air conditioning, it had tiled floors, it had a fire suppression system hanging from the roof. It had full electrical wiring and lights underground. Very, very impressive engineering feats. We did some open source intelligence when we got back as well, where we looked at how on earth they'd hidden this. And what we found was, over the years of building, they'd been building a road on top of this mountain that went nowhere. So they'd taken the spoil out, put it down, said it was the road, but the road just went absolutely nowhere. So that's a really interesting thing. And then we also looked at the electrics. We looked at the light fixtures, and we looked at the tubing and the making, the marks that were on them. And they're only available in Iran for sale. So that was really interesting as well. But the most interesting thing is, from a soldier's perspective, was how the tunnel was designed. It was completely straight. A few little bends here and there, but nothing major. But what that tells you as a soldier, this is not a tunnel that was designed to be fought in. Okay, so it's not designed to be fought in. What's it for? It's a staging tunnel. As you come out of the exit back into the graveyard, you climb up out and you look down the hill, and there's Abufim between the two hills that are in front of you. It's designed so that Hezbollah fighters could go to the tunnel in their civilian clothes, change into uniform, pick up their weapons, and launch downhill into Israel. That's what the tunnel was for. And that's now been flooded with concrete by the IDF. But yeah, so that was really interesting, visiting that part of Lebanon. That's the only bit of Lebanon I've been to, so I still need to go to Beirut. But when it comes to the way this is operated in the West, I think it goes back to the Soviet Union, particularly for the Palestinian issue. But of course, Lebanon, PLO, strong connection, so I think it all ties together. But the Soviet Union were clearly trying to spread their influence around the world. And the major American foothold in the Middle East was Israel. Everything else, particularly look at North Africa, heavily funded by the Soviet Union. Gaddafi was in Libya, was kept afloat by Soviet money. And a lot of the reason for the Arab Spring is that in 1989, all that money dried up. The funding wasn't coming through, and you had generally strongmen from minority tribal groups in charge of these countries. And the majority eventually didn't see the benefits of that Soviet money anymore, and it took them 10, 20 years to actually get angry enough to try and overthrow the government. But you can trace all of that back to the death of Soviet, what we call Arab socialism. But when it comes to trying to fight Israel, that's because it was America's big outpost in the Middle East, is how they saw it. And we see 1964, we see Yasser Arafat come out of Egypt, go to Moscow, get his degree, and then come back to the Middle East and start Palestinian Liberation Organization. Now, prior to 1964, sort of 1967, Palestinian wasn't even a thing. It wasn't even, aim of Palestinian kind of applied to Israelis, it applied to Arabs, it didn't really matter. It was just a kind of generic catch-all term. But they changed the narrative. Again, I've talked about the power of narratives. All of a sudden, the Palestinians weren't a bunch of Arabs from all around the Middle East who'd come to Israel to work and had left, stayed behind in two areas after the 1948 war. 1967 war, Gaza was run by Egypt. The West Bank was the West Bank of the River Jordan. It was run by Jordan. Nobody was talking about Palestine then. They had years, if the Arabs cared that much about a free Palestine, they had years where they controlled what is considered Palestine today, and yet they did nothing. And the reason this has all changed is through Yasser Arafat and the PLO. And the Soviet Union were very good at targeting their sympathizers in the West with the narratives that they wanted to see. And they targeted certainly the far left in the UK and in other countries with this Palestinian narrative. And it's the dominant one now that runs. But that's why this is such a touchstone issue to particularly the far left in the UK. I don't know, it's the same in Europe.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so it's the same things because these were the people whose ideological ancestors were targeted by the Soviet Union with this propaganda. And we can see Soviet psychological tactics being used even today. And there's a variety of stuff published in the 80s talking about the kind of narrative fight against Israel. And honestly, I could read you a chapter from it, and you'd think it had been written yesterday. It's still the same old tactics, where nothing the Israelis say can be believed, everything the Palestinians say can be believed, oppressor versus oppressed. It's all there. So I think to answer your question, that's where this problem in the West that we have comes from. It's from decades of Soviet propaganda, but social media has now given it the chance to go viral. Everyone has a phone, everyone scrolls through their phone. It's far, far easier to persuade someone with an upsetting image, with a child that's been injured or in a family that's been killed. It's far easier to persuade them with an image than it is to persuade them with critical thinking, where they have to read and engage their brains. And so you're fighting a very, very challenging fight because people are activated, they're upset because they've seen a dead child, to then tell them that actually, under the laws of war, that's legal collateral damage, which is terribly sad, but it doesn't make it illegal. I don't want to hear that. They're upset about a dead child. So it becomes incredibly tricky. Could that answer that? Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I do think that it's me.
Oh, it's you. I'm so sorry.
sorry.
I'll tell you what, I won't say more.
No, yeah, yeah.
Shatters will tell me who you are in the face.
I'm a doctor in this town.
Però så länge det som bara förlovligt så är det det. Och bara
Nie pojęcy podziwiam.
yeah, but such seriously. So
Right, thanks for it. Excellent. So I'm a doctor in this town. That's not well, but my name is Shure, and I wonder about the surprising difficult start of the war on Yom Kippur. It's happened before. It's a place of tensions historically. I was so surprised at start Israel and Yom.
There's a couple of reasons. The first one being that they got complacent. It's as simple as that in the first instance. They were convinced by a very clever Hamas deception campaign where Hamas had said, hey, keep getting Qatar to give us money. We're not a threat. Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they're the threat. And they staged that war in 2017 with PIJ, convincing them that they were the Iranian-backed threat, all of which is true, but they also convinced Israel that they weren't a threat. And then we see a very similar situation to 9/11 in America, where they had all the pieces of intelligence they needed, but nobody put them together. So when the young girls who were doing their 2 years of service were in the lookout post at Nahal Oz, a military base, and they were, seeing Hamas conducting rehearsals and reporting it back up the chain, that was ignored. So that was a real failing there, and you can ask your own questions. I don't have an answer as to why they were ignored, but they were ignored. Just before the attack, Hamas put Israeli SIM cards into their phones, and so the Israelis picked up a flood of Israeli SIM cards activating within Gaza, but didn't put two and two together. And the other factor was that they were focused on Lebanon. They were focused on Hezbollah and the Radwan forces, the special forces of Hezbollah. They were the ones that they thought were going to come down from the north and commit a 7th of October style attack. And from the tunnel I saw, that's exactly what Hezbollah were planning. But it didn't get to that point because the Israelis on 7th of October moved 4 battalions of armor into the north, which deterred Hezbollah from joining in. And that's probably one of the most decisive moves that was made on that particular day, was to move those troops into the north. And then finally, of course, the complacency meant that when it came to a Jewish holiday, as it was on 7th of October, they felt comfortable in sending their troops home for the holiday. It's that simple. It's a mixture of complacency, negligence, and a failure of intelligence. And you speak to anyone in the IDF, and certainly anyone in a senior rank who was in command on that day, they feel that failure incredibly hard. They know how badly they messed that up. And then did you want to know about the response as well?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's much, much harder to get troops somewhere, even in a small country like Israel, than you might imagine. So, for example, tanks have truck hours. If I wanted to drive a tank from here to Christiansand, you wouldn't just drive it on the road. You have to put it on a low loader, you have to truck it there, or you could put it on train tracks maybe. But Israel's not set up at this point in time, on 7th of October 2023, to have the ability to move their armor around the country at any pace or speed. You've also got everyone at home for the holidays. Jewish people very often turn their phones off on holidays. They certainly do on Shabbat. But the soldiers might not have been there to pick up the phone. And then, of course, once you've got these soldiers spread around the country, their base in Re'im has been smashed. A lot of people from Golani Brigade were killed on 7th of October because that was the unit that was down there. So that brigade has been decapitated. That brigade is now out of action. The soldiers' uniforms, weapons would all have been down there in Re'im, so they have to get the rest of the IDF in. And then those soldiers have to get to their bases. They have to get their weapons out. They have to get their vehicles ready to go. They have to get orders. They have to issue radios. They have to fill the radios with the crypto that you need to make the radios work. All of this stuff takes minutes, but those minutes build up into hours. And that's why there was initially just a response of units just taking themselves down there on their own volition to go and commit some quite remarkable acts of bravery. Cool.
No, my name is Darshan. I have a question, and then it's a kind of not the elephant in the room, but the camel, and it's Islam. And I read the book by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Pray, from 2021. And I mean, we see it now in Oslo, the presence of Islam, also where I live at Murstrand, is more and more, and this is problematic also because, in Norway we have a kind of state church with 3.2 million people.
And røyk den. Den er stabil, men jeg kan snakke veldig litt. Ok.
Okay. Okay, I continue. Yeah.
Please do.
Yeah. And that's the problem. We have this kind of state church, but as a Catholic, I would say, okay. But the main problem is the knowledge on Islam is lacking totally. They don't understand the main goal for Hamas, the whole idea, the great Satan and the small Satan. And when I say this or write this in social media, I'm of course a racist and I am an Islamophobe. And as you said beforehand, this is very well planned. Because I see a huge problem in Norway or in the West when it's about freedom of speech. They have taken away the possibility, and we also have in this last thing is we have in paragraph 185, hate speech paragraph. It's mainly made, it's very practical for Islam, because if I am critical to that religion, I make hate speech that is. So, can you say something about Islam within this huge conflict? Because one needs other countries, Islamic countries, to come and help. Yeah.
But can I answer this question without getting arrested? Yes. Look, I think we need to split out Islamism from Islam. There are perfectly decent Muslims doing in the West who are quite happy to embrace our societies and our cultures. The issue when it comes to Gaza particularly, I think, is a number of very, very poorly understood Islamic ideas. And the first one is waqf. Okay, and that's the idea that once territory has been Muslim, it is haram for it to be in the hands of anyone else. There's also the idea of the Ummah, where they see Jews killing their fellow Muslims, and they immediately stick together effectively. It's it's unacceptable that Jews should be killing Muslims, and we saw a very good example of this, I think, in Qatar when Israel tried to kill Hamas's leadership. So all of these states that have been playing nice with Israel, so even the UAE, even Saudi Arabia, all of them got together for that conference immediately afterwards to condemn what Israel had done. Okay, so there is always a very clear line of tolerance, particularly when it comes to the Jews and Islam, and so certainly the more extremist parts of Islam. And the other thing I would pull out, because I think it's underappreciated, is how the Muslim Brotherhood operate. Okay, they are a serious threat. They are a part of Sunni Islam, and they are banned in numerous countries in the Middle East. Okay, so this is not a group that is kind of a really popular kind of Middle Eastern idea that kind of we have to tolerate here. Absolutely not. This is banned in the Middle East. And the way they operate is the same way that Hamas operated in Gaza. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, and they effectively go from the bottom up. They don't try and come in and invade a country and take it over from the top down. They come in at the bottom. What they did in Gaza, they built mosques. They pushed out. The number of mosques in Gaza nearly quintupled. They went 5 times the number of mosques once the Muslim Brotherhood got into Gaza. And they preach radical version of Islam in these mosques. They also put money into organizations that are kind of deniable, so into charities, into the media, into the university sector. And look no further than Qatar, another major Muslim Brotherhood country, and how they operate in the West. They own more of London than the royal family. Okay? This is how they operate. And then all of a sudden they get a groundswell of support. And in the UK, we're now starting to see radical Muslim politicians being elected. Okay, and again, that is also part of their strategy. So that's the bit that really concerns me. I think it's perfectly possible to coexist with certain Muslims, and they're good people, but you have these incredibly negative ideas that just pollute everything, and they particularly come in like a cancer when it comes to the issue of Israel. There's Gaza. Who's got the microphone? Anyone? Okay, I'll just go rogue. I'm going to go to this side because this side's had all the love. So, yes, so
Yeah. So today I'm reading that Hamas is sort of massing it like the yellow line, right? They're probing the IDF.
Could you stand up, since we don't have a mic, please, so that we could hear you better?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm reading today that Hamas is massing at the yellow line, probing the IDF, which is the response Netanyahu is giving now. But at the same time, they want the ceasefire to continue. And is that because they have a grand strategy, or is it because they're just disorganized, given the tale of the sort of returning or not returning bodies?
I think it's because they're confident. I think they're confident in a couple of things. The first thing is that Trump won't let the war go full bore again. Okay, I think he is very keen that he has his peace deal to trumpet. He's made a big deal about that. And I sense that he'll let the IDF go so far, but no further. The next thing is, actually, what are the IDF achieving by getting back in? You know, they can turn Hamas goons into dust. They can kill as many of them as they want. Hell, they killed 25,000 already. But even with that hit, Hamas still, I think we're seeing, particularly since the ceasefire came into effect, they still have huge amounts of control of Gaza. So it's all very good and well, just turning Hamas dudes into dust. What's that actually achieving strategically? I think Hamas have been very confident that they can retain certainly a presence in Gaza. What that looks like going forward, I think they want two things. They want to survive and they want to retain controls of the levers of power. Now, this is a really nuanced point, I think, when it comes to Hamas, is how they achieve things. Now, think back to what I just said about how the Muslim Brotherhood operates. They're quite happy to restart this whole process over again. You know, got success they had in 2005, they know how they got there. They can just do it all over again. And if we look to Basra, there's a really good example of what happened in 2004-5, where the British down in Basra, we held that city. We were praised for how quiet it was compared to the rest of Iraq. Now, the Americans up in the Sunni Triangle in the north were fighting this kind of nihilistic insurgency that committed all sorts of horrific kind of atrocities. The British enemy was very different. It was mainly Shia. And as we knocked over Saddam Hussein's regime, the Iranians flooded the area with political influence. And what we saw was that area at peaks, because what was happening was all these radical Shia parties were busy seizing control of the leaders of power. They were busy getting themselves in a position to be elected. They were elected. Islamic Basra took about 67% of the vote in Basra. And as soon as they got power, violence erupted against the British because they were then the only thing standing between these extremist Shias and power. And I think that is the game that Hamas will look to play in Gaza. They're quite happy to poke Israel, probe Israel, get a limited response. Cool, some of our people died. That's great. They're Punta Jana. They get their virgins. They're happy. No problem at all. These are a death cult at the end of the day. And if they lose a few fighters, that's fine. But what it does is, A, Israel keeps getting smashed on the world stage because they've broken the ceasefire, is how it will be reported, and they know that. And secondly, it actually buys them more time to consolidate their control over Gaza. Because they can operate at night, they can make sure these plans are fleeted, and they're then in a position of strength. So that's what I think is happening.
All right, sir.
Go on, there, you go for it. Seize the initiative.
I just have a question. You know, the Hamas and their connection with the Hezbollah and all the other, what should I probably call them, terrorist organizations, the whole Middle East, because there are, lots of them, and the ISIS and, all the areas around, the connections with all these groups. And the second question, do you have an idea how much money that Hamas has been paying by the different NGOs, United Nations, etc.?
I'll do your second question first, because I've got another paper coming out on something called cash voucher assistance, which means it's incredibly difficult to answer your question, because now look at an area like Gaza where Hamas runs everything. Okay, if you give cash voucher assistance to a family, say here's $20 for you to spend, who are they going to spend it with? if Hamas run everything. Okay, so if they go to an aid site to get the aid, they pay their $20, they get their aid, great, but that $20 goes to Hamas. So the complicity of NGOs in this, and actually, I think they're mostly coming from a good place. There's some NGOs that are on the line. Most of them just generally want to help people and actually don't care where the money goes as long as people get fed. And I can see that argument. But what it means is the money that floods into Gaza is very, very difficult to track. Your first question, where did these groups come from? Well, there was an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps general called Soleimani, was killed in the last Trump administration. Well, IRGC being Iran's kind of expeditionary kind of army. And he gave a speech, and I went to, fingers in the air. But he basically spoke to the council in Tehran and said, I've built you an army. And the army was that ring of fire around Israel. So you have Hezbollah in Lebanon, again, a direct proxy for Iran. There's no kind of, we're just going to give you some money, like these are putting that, to the point where the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon was injured in the pager attack. He had a Hezbollah pager. That's how close they were. Hezbollah were also active in Syria, working for al-Assad. So we're seeing that footprint there as well. You've then got the West Bank, where Iran was absolutely funneling arms across to the various terrorist groups that are in the West Bank. We then have the Houthis down in Yemen, who've been going through a civil war for well over a decade now. And that kind of turned into Iran and Russia versus kind of America, Saudi and the UAE and Bahrain. They were all sending troops in. So that's been a horrible proxy war for a long time, but again, big Iranian involvement. Hamas have fallings out with Iran, particularly over ISIS, because Hamas are Sunni Muslim Brotherhood, Iran is Shia. And so when Iran's policy towards ISIS, they had a big falling out for a while, they began talk, and then they eventually kissed and made up. But the Hamas element were not a direct proxy. They were allies of Iran, but not that direct proxy, but they certainly spoke and coordinated. So that was kind of the ring of steel around Israel, and the big kind of unlocking of that came with the defeat of Hezbollah, because they had 150,000 rockets pointed at Tel Aviv, and the idea was that if Israel did anything against Iran, they could overwhelm Israel's missile defenses in an afternoon. And the fact that Israel was able to wipe out that rocket supply. Now, don't get me wrong, they had thousands of people displaced from northern Israel. They had the Majd al-Shams tragedy where those children were killed playing football. They took a lot of incoming rocket fire. But because of how well the IDF performed, they weren't able to get all of those rockets in the air at the same time. And so as Hezbollah collapsed, that basically collapsed the entire ring of steel around Israel, which paved the way then for those attacks on Tehran and on the nuclear facilities that we saw earlier this year.
Okay, so I finally found. Well. Okay, I did not find a microphone that worked. No. Oh? Yeah. Okay. I think there was one here first. Yeah. I'm not sure if this is enough, so just speak loud if.
Yeah. Does it work? No.
Earlier this year, genocide experts and what? Earlier this year, genocide not playing, right? Yeah, I'm good. So genocide experts and the UN declare that there is a genocide in Gaza. So first of all, I don't understand how that came to be, and how can people respond to people use that as
Yeah, of course. Okay, so the question for those who didn't hear was if the UN had put out a report saying it's genocide, and if the International Association of Genocide Scholars have said that, how can you argue against it? It's relatively simple, but it does require people to engage their brains, unfortunately, and that's always the challenge when it comes to this debate. Ooh. So let's talk about the Genocide Convention. Okay, it's the intent to destroy a group of people using 5 different things that can happen, so killing them, injuring them, stopping births, and a couple of others that skip my mind right now because I'm not a genocide lawyer. But what I can tell you is, just as if you or I committed a crime right now, we leave here, we stab someone in the street, that's a crime. Okay, and it's the crime of murder. And why is it murder? Because you intended to kill someone. Okay, so the intent is absolutely critical. Now, if we went to a court, certainly in the UK, I'm assuming it's the same in Norway. If you went to court in the UK, certainly the burden of proof is beyond reasonable doubt. Okay? If you go to civil courts, it's on the balance of probabilities, which is 51%. Beyond reasonable doubt is right up here. The intent bar for genocide is even higher. Okay, the intent bar for genocide is that it cannot be anything else. And nothing I have seen has suggested that there is an intent from Israel to wipe out all Palestinians. Okay, they use speeches from various politicians like Yoav Gallant, Netanyahu, the President Herzog, but they've cherry-picked lines from their speeches. If you then go put those lines back in context and read the rest of the speech, it's very clear that when they talk about fighting human animals, they're talking about Hamas. In the line they picked from Herzog's speech, he goes on in the very next clause of the sentence. It's not even a different sentence, it's after the comma. He talks about how the IDF will do their best to protect civilians. So straight away, there's a huge stretch there. And then just look at what's happened on the ground. They dropped 100,000 plus tons of munitions, and yet they've only killed 68,000 people. Even if they were all civilians, and that was a war crime, which I don't think it was, but say it was for hypothesis. Even that suggests one of two things. They didn't mean to kill everyone, or they're the worst shots on the planet. How do you drop that many bombs and only kill 68,000 people, especially when so many of them are in the humanitarian area? And talk about strikes in the humanitarian area. 2.7% of all the strikes throughout the war took place in Al-Mawasi, which is where most of the civilians were sheltered. Okay, now, if you were just indiscriminately killing Palestinians, like, you've got fish in a barrel right there. You've got like over 1 million civilians just sat there on the beach. If you wanted to wipe them all out, then that's just 2 gun runs. That's easy. And yet they didn't do it. They managed to put 300,000 soldiers into Gaza. If this was a genocide, that they were trying to kill all of the Gazans, they put 300,000 troops in there, and they haven't even managed to kill 1 Gazan each. Okay, so just the facts on the ground don't match this genocide allegation. And when we talk about the two organizations you mentioned, the International Association of Genocide Scholars and the UN, when it comes to the IOGX, interestingly, anyone can join. Anyone can join. In the aftermath of this report come out, people signed up and signed up their dogs. I think Adolf Hitler was signed up as a member. This is what we call, once again, we spoke about the halo effect. Because it's called the IAGS, it comes with weight. Actually, their membership, I think they added something like 75% of their membership after 7th of October. The vast majority of whom came from Iraq. Work that out. So this is not a credible organisation, and yet it's presented as us, the organisation. The same goes with the UN committee that released that report. The whole report, I think they mentioned Hamas once. And this was written by 3 rapporteurs, all of whom now have a long history of anti-Israel activism. Okay, so I can attack the substance of their argument, as I have just done as well, but you can also say that this is not a fair and balanced and honest report. It's not the UN saying it. It's one UN committee. It's the Human Rights Committee, which has things like Iran chairing the Women's Council. Okay, this is not a fair and balanced report in either case. Yeah, come, Jim.
I have 2 questions. The first is Norway has acknowledged so-called Palestinian state and other countries as well. Can you give your view about that, or how that has affected the dynamics in Gaza war? And the second question is, even though you don't have the solution to this, as you mentioned, can you tell a few principles or which you think is the best way forward?
First question really easy, second question really difficult. The first question was, what difference did Norway and other countries recognising a Palestinian state have? Zero. On the ground, absolutely nothing whatsoever. There's a suggestion that the announcement of it by France, UK, Canada made Hamas torpedo a hostage deal. That's been suggested. But in terms of practical effect on the ground, absolutely nothing whatsoever. So we can forget that. I think it's a way of virtue signalling to a domestic audience more than anything else. When it comes to principles and guidance, and in the second question, for how we go forward, I think the first principle is the 7th of October can never happen again. We said never again back in 1945, and it turns out we didn't mean it. So I think never again really does need to mean never again going forward. So that's the first principle, I think. The second principle I suggest would have to be that when we look at how politics in Gaza going forward, how that takes shape, how that emerges, I think we just have to be very careful not to repeat the mistakes of the past and allow that to be subverted by Hamas or a rebranded Hamas or allies of Hamas. So that's the next one. The third one is the reconstruction needs to take place somehow. So you need to have a mechanism in place to make sure that doesn't get perverted again. You know, so no more tunnels are built, no more lead piping repurposed as rockets, whatever it might be. So you have to make sure that reconstruction happens in a real, genuine way. But other than that, you know, it is very, very difficult. I don't have many answers, but I think if you can make sure Israel's borders are safe, make sure that the political process isn't subverted, and make sure reconstruction isn't subverted, then that's a good thing going forward. So, go. You don't have longer, so. We need a border wall down the middle.
Yeah, all right. I try to do it in English, that is your mother tongue, I suppose. So, I will. I recognized what you said about the Soviet Union, and I do think that you can see the same thing more or less in the policy of Russia today, because it's more or less the same thing. And I do think that the Russians are very happy for this conflict going in Gaza, because whether that is planned, but I think it's due to the Western journalists, that it takes a lot of pressure away from their campaign in Ukraine, and that many people in the Western countries, especially those on the left side, they can easily concentrate on Gaza, and they don't need to stay up for all the problems which we do have in Europe concerning the Russia aggression towards certainly Ukraine, but in fact the whole Western Europe. And I do think that that people in Norway actually are so frightened what can happen with our country in the north, in the sea, North Sea, or towards the Northern Pole, all this Barents Sea. They are so actually afraid for what can happen, that they actually, in a way, psychological way, they emphasize on the conflict in Gaza, because then they can actually have some morale to it. But I do think that
The question on this.
yeah. No, the question is how you actually see this situation. I think you got my point.
The situation in the West,
Yeah.
basically, where we go from here.
Yeah.
We've got another hour. I'll try to keep this relatively short. So, look, I think what the Gaza war has done is blow open a number of divisions in the West that we didn't realise were there. And what our politicians really need to do is look at why those divisions have happened and first of all, acknowledging the problems, the first part. And I think our politicians are very often scared to admit there's a problem. Now, how have we allowed our young people to be utterly subverted by social media? How have we allowed a situation where a sort of non-European culture can come in and take over our streets? I mean, look in Birmingham, and I'm an Aston Villa fan. In Birmingham, my club have been put in a position where Maccabi fans can't come to the area where our football ground is because they're not safe. Like, how did we let that happen? And to put a name on that problem is really challenging, I think, because the second you do so, you will get those hate crime arrests. You will get accused of being Islamophobic. And that's an incredibly difficult thing. So it needs bravery on the political front, I think, to fix this. And then we have to take a long look at our media and how badly they failed us. You know, you've got a state broadcaster I saw just the last week who was making jokes about Jews. I had that clip made it all the way to the UK. We don't often get Norwegian news in the UK, but that one did come all the way across. I think Haaland is the only one that we get regularly when it comes to Norway, but yeah, that's what anti-Semitism did make it across. But how did that media culture come about? You know, where's that coming from? And I think we need to ask serious questions, particularly of our state broadcasters, both Norwegian and British, as to how this kind of groupthink has been allowed to emerge. So putting a name on the problem is the first thing, and that takes bravery. The second thing is examining how our media let this occur. And then thirdly, I think we have to address the cancer that is social media. The unfiltered disinformation propaganda that booms into everyone's face on a daily, hourly, minutely basis. That needs to be addressed. I think there needs to be some accountability for social media companies for allowing this to happen as well. And then fourthly, probably teaching critical thinking in schools.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. You have been waiting for a long time, so it's all right.
We can always speak afterwards if everyone still has a question. So we'll chat afterwards.
Jay, brilliant. On the nose, how do we keep Jews in Norwegian society? Okay. So I have friends who are based up to Switzerland. Did they myself? A great country. I'd like to have people stay here and feel safe. We talk about genocide in this particular war. I calculated the other day in the Excel sheet, all the countries around Israel. It's about 340 million Arabs with Muslim colleagues. Then there are another 85 in Iran and 65 in Turkey or vice versa. We're not killing all of them. Nobody's killing all of them. So why is Israel losing the media war? Why is it losing, the stance that they truly have? It should be a no-brainer, and it is for many of us sitting here. I'm sure, and for me, I have Muslims in my family. I have Christians in my family, and I have Jewish in my families. We can have Christmas. We can have all kinds of holidays together. Is no problem. Why is the liberal left attacking, and why is the LGBTQ attacking the people? Which part of Norway sees Gaza or the West Bank as a star somewhere where we want to be, or something that we would like to learn from? Why is that?
So you get Ramadan, Christmas, and Hanukkah. You're a lucky man. The reason Israel lost the war on the information battlefield is they just didn't fight it, I think, is the blunt line. Okay, stand fast. There's 1 billion Muslims in the world, and there's only a very few Jewish people. Actually, I don't like that argument because that implies that all 1 billion Muslims are bad. I don't think that's true. We have countries like the UAE and Saudi that show that this kind of rapprochement, this kind of peaceful coexistence is certainly possible eventually. But I spoke to an Israeli general of that.
The peaceful countries, you can ask the people living there, right? So
yeah, of course. That's the same. That's the same for every country, of course. But the bottom line here is that Israel were too busy fighting the shooting war, the trigger war, and they didn't think that the information war mattered. Because actually, so far in Israel's history, it hasn't mattered. They've always been the bad guy. Certainly since 1967. when Arafat turned that narrative on its head and made the oppressor versus oppressed storyline come into existence. Certainly since 67, Israel has been no longer the underdog and always the bad guy, and it's never really hurt them that much. But that was before social media. And that's been the huge difference in this war, has been the ability for Hamas to spread their message in a viral manner, almost at the apples. So that's been the really big difference. But I spoke to a general from Israel. I said, look, why haven't you done this information stuff? And he goes, I don't have time to fight this war. I'm fighting the real war. And he said, I can understand that. It shouldn't have been the army's job. It should have been the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and they've been completely absent. So I do hold them responsible for that. But it was a difficult fight, and they weren't ready for it. They were caught by surprise, both on the ground and in the information area. They just didn't see this coming. And if, once the narrative is set, it's so hard to change it. And Hamas got right in there, set the narrative. 7th of October was forgotten almost immediately. As soon as the first missile landed in Gaza, 7th of October was forgotten because Hamas were ready. And then your sort of final part of that is, how do you keep Jewish people in Norway safe? Well, it's everyone in this room. You just have to make your voice heard. And that's not easy. I have a large social media following. I get death threats every week for the position I take. I get direct messages just full of abuse on a daily basis. And actually, it grinds you down. It's tiring. It's designed to intimidate you. It's designed to silence you. It doesn't work for me because I have a big following. So I have lots of supporters who, when I feel it's all getting a bit aggressive, people come in and they lift me up, and that kind of works really well. But for someone who doesn't have a huge following, I can imagine that level of abuse must be incredibly intimidating and incredibly threatening. And so if you do put your head above the parapet for Jewish people and for Israel, you're going to take some incoming fire. And you have to be ready for that. But that's why it needs courage to stand up and say, we value our Jewish populations, we cherish their presence in our countries, and we want them to stay. Because they're Norwegian, they're British, they're American, whatever it might be. And that should be indivisible. So that's my message. I think probably a good one to finish on, is just to raise your voices and be heard. Thanks very much.
It's 2025. America's debt is over $37 trillion, and the dollar just had its worst crash since 1973. That puts your savings and your family's future at risk. That's why we trust Alpha Omega Gold, a company that stands unapologetically with Israel and supports Stand Tall Israel. Visit ao.gold/stand to claim your free precious metals wayfinder guide, or call 1-855-426-4653 today. Protect your future before it's too late.